May 12, 1968, 3:30 in the morning. The darkness over Fire Support Base Coral is absolute. Rain has stopped. Mud fills every fighting hole. 2,500 Australian soldiers have been on the ground for less than 12 hours. Their defenses are incomplete. Wire is not strung. Claymore mines are not laid. Shell scrapes are 15 centimeters deep. Some men are still above ground. In the blackness beyond the perimeter, 900 North Vietnamese Army regulars from the 141st Regiment lie motionless, 250 meters away. They have been there for hours, watching, waiting, marking their assault lanes with silent precision. The Australians do not know they are there. The 7th NVA Division headquarters, 9 kilometers east, has given the order. Attack before dawn. Destroy the Australians before they can dig in, before they can fortify, before they become the ghosts that Vietnamese soldiers whisper about in the jungle. At precisely 3:30 a.m., the sky erupts. Rockets scream overhead. Mortars thunder down. RPG-7s streak through the darkness like fireflies of death. The Battle of Coral has begun, and before the sun rises, the world will witness why the North Vietnamese Army learned to fear the sound of Australian voices in the dark. If you want to see more untold stories from the Vietnam War, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Vietnam War Records family. We bring you the real history, the documented battles, the verified accounts that most people never hear about. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today. The story of what happened at Fire Support Base Coral and its sister base Balmoral in May and June of 1968 is not just about numbers. It is not just about 108 men, though that number echoes from another famous Australian stand 2 years earlier at Long Tan. This story is about something far larger. It is about how an entire Australian task force of approximately 2,500 to 3,000 soldiers faced down the full fury of the North Vietnamese Army's 7th Division. How they fought battles that lasted not hours but weeks. How they turned what should have been a disaster into one of the most decisive victories of the Vietnam War, and how they destroyed an enemy division so thoroughly that it ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But to understand what happened in those deadly weeks of May 1968, you must first understand why the Australians were different, why the North Vietnamese commanders issued warnings about them, why captured documents spoke of the silent killers who moved through the jungle like smoke, why Viet Cong units requested transfer rather than face Australian patrols. The answer lies not in superior weapons or greater numbers, but in doctrine, in training, in a philosophy of war forged in the jungles of Malaya, a decade before Vietnam ever became an American war. The Americans fought Vietnam with overwhelming firepower. So, helicopter assaults, massive artillery bombardments, B-52 strikes that turned square kilometers into moonscapes. They moved in battalion and brigade strength, announced their presence with the thunder of Hueys, called in napalm and high explosive on anything that moved. The American way of war was loud, visible, technologically advanced, and devastatingly powerful. It was also predictable. The North Vietnamese learned to hear the helicopters coming, learned to strike after the Americans had swept through and moved on. The Americans owned the day. The Vietnamese owned the night. That was the pattern. That was the rhythm of the war for American units. But the Australians did not fight that way. They fought with silence, with patience, with small unit tactics refined over years of counterinsurgency warfare against communist guerrillas in the jungles of Malaya. Australian platoons and companies moved through the bush making no sound. They did not hack their way through vegetation. They moved around obstacles. They used hand signals instead of radio chips. They walked where the ground was soft, where leaves would not crackle, where they would leave no trace. An Australian patrol could pass within meters of an enemy position and never be detected. And then, hours later, that same enemy position would erupt in a storm of carefully aimed rifle fire and grenades as the Australians sprang an ambush from positions they had occupied in total silence for half a day. The Australians patrolled constantly, not sweeps, not search and destroy. Patrolling. Slow, methodical, exhausting work that covered every meter of their operational area again and again. They set ambushes and waited, sometimes for days. They tracked enemy units like hunters tracking dangerous game, following signs that American units would never notice, building a picture of enemy movement patterns, supply routes, base camps. Then they struck with surgical precision. High kill ratio, minimal Australian casualties. The enemy learned that engaging Australians meant dying. so they tried to avoid them, tried to move around the Australian operational area in Phook Tue province. But the Australians controlled their ground. Every village, every trail, every river crossing, they knew the terrain, they knew the people, they knew where the enemy would be before the enemy knew it themselves. This was the force that arrived at Fire Support Base Coral on May 12, 1968. Not green troops, not draftees fresh from training. These were soldiers from the 1st Australian Task Force, professional infantrymen, gunners who could shoot, move, and communicate under fire. They were led by experienced officers and NCOs who had learned their craft in previous wars, in previous jungles, against previous enemies who had also learned to fear them. But on May 12th, they made mistakes. Serious mistakes. Mistakes that should have killed them. The operation was called Toan Thang, Complete Victory. It was a massive combined offensive involving 70,000 American, South Vietnamese, Australian, New Zealand, and Thai troops. The goal was to block North Vietnamese withdrawal routes after the second general offensive, the so-called mini-Tet attacks that had struck Saigon 1 week earlier. Intelligence reported that elements of the NVA 7th Division were in the area north of Saigon, withdrawing toward Cambodia. The 1st Australian Task Force was ordered to deploy from their base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thu Province to an area 45 kilometers north of Saigon, 60 kilometers from home, outside their normal operational, into terrain they did not know, into an area the Americans called the Catcher's Mitt, into what was, unknown to most of the Australian soldiers flying in on helicopters that morning, a killing ground prepared by North Vietnamese commanders who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The insertion was a disaster, not because of enemy action, because of poor planning, poor coordination, poor reconnaissance. The helicopters were delayed. Units that should have arrived together came in piecemeal, sometimes 4 hours late. Artillery batteries landed before their infantry protection arrived, sitting exposed in open clearings. Units were put down in the wrong locations. The area selected for the landing zone turned out to be covered in low trees and scrub, forcing diversions to alternate LZs. No low-level aerial reconnaissance had been conducted. The American pilot flying the Australian battalion commanders over the area before the insertion refused to fly below 2,000 feet and made only one pass. "Too dangerous," he said. "Enemy in the area." That should have been a warning. It was not heeded. During the afternoon, an Australian patrol found something disturbing. One, fighting positions prepared by an organized military force. Positions that indicated an enemy unit had been in the area recently, preparing for battle. That should have been a warning. It was treated as an indication of enemy presence, but not as an immediate threat. The Australians expected small Viet Cong groups withdrawing from Saigon, avoiding contact, moving quickly through the area. They did not expect what was actually there. 2 full North Vietnamese Army regiments, the 141st and the 165th, each at near full strength, 1,500 to 1,800 men per regiment, plus the 275 and 269th infiltration groups, all under the command of the 7th NVA Division, all within striking distance of Fire Support Base Coral, all watching the Australians land, all preparing to attack. As darkness fell on May 12th, the Australians were scattered across an area of several square kilometers. Rifle companies had been sent out to establish night harbor positions and ambush sites in an arc extending 5 kilometers from the base perimeter. The base itself was only partially prepared. Headquarters elements, artillery batteries, mortar platoons, engineers, and support units were inside a perimeter that existed more on map overlays than in reality. There was no concertina wire, no claymore mines, no overhead cover on command posts. Soldiers had dug shell scrapes, but most were barely 15 centimeters deep. Weapons pits for machine guns and mortars were incomplete. The gunners of 102 Field Battery Royal Australian Artillery had their 6 105mm howitzers positioned and ready to fire, but their defensive positions around the guns were hasty at best. The mortar platoon from 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 18 men with 8 1-player millimeter mortars, were dug in adjacent to the battery. Their platoon commander, Lieutenant Tony Jensen, looked at the darkness beyond the perimeter and felt uneasy. So did others. Veterans later recalled a sense of foreboding as night fell. Something was wrong. Something was out there. They could not see it, could not hear it, but they knew. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton, commanding 3 RA, was certain the enemy would attack that night. He ordered his soldiers to dig deeper, to prepare. Some did. Some were too exhausted. Some thought they would improve their positions in the morning. Morning seemed very far away. At approximately 4 p.m., fleeting contacts began. Small enemy groups probing the perimeter. Australian soldiers drove them off. These were not attacks. They were reconnaissance. The North Vietnamese were identifying Australian positions. They were marking assault lanes. They were preparing. 900 meters to the northeast, a North Vietnamese battalion from the 141st Regiment was conducting final preparations. Officers moved among the assault companies, checking weapons, distributing ammunition, pointing out objectives. The primary target was the artillery. Capture or destroy the Australian guns and the entire base would collapse. Secondary targets were the mortar positions and command elements. The attack would be preceded by a preparatory barrage of mortars, rockets, and RPGs. Then the assault companies would advance in waves, human wave attacks, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers and violence of action. This was conventional warfare. NVA doctrine, assault tactics perfected against French and American positions over 2 decades of war. The North Vietnamese were confident. They had the advantage of surprise. The Australians were unprepared. The defenses were incomplete. This would be over in an hour. At precisely 3:30 a.m. on May 13, 1968, the bombardment began. Rockets streaked out of the darkness. Mortar rounds crashed down. RPG-7s arced through the black sky, trailing sparks. The concentration of fire fell heaviest on 102 Field Battery and the 1 Raw Mortar Platoon. The NVA forward observers had done their job well. For 5 minutes the barrage continued. Then silence. A 10-minute pause. Absolute quiet except for the ringing in men's ears and the screams of the wounded. Australian soldiers lay in their shallow scrapes, weapons ready, staring into darkness so complete they could see nothing. Then the assault began. 200 North Vietnamese soldiers rose from positions just 250 meters from the perimeter. They had been there for hours, lying in the mud, motionless, silent, invisible. Now they charged, firing as they came. AK-47s on full automatic. RPGs launching at point-blank range. Grenades flying and screaming, shouting, blowing whistles, creating chaos and terror. The first wave hit the mortar platoon. Bombardier Andy Forsdyke was lying with his M60 machine gun team 20 meters in front of 102 Field Battery when the enemy appeared. VC got up from all around us, he later wrote. They had crawled up to within 4 feet of the M60 and we did not even know they were there. Breathing distance. The enemy were holding their AK-47s up in the air, spraying bullets everywhere. Forsdyke's team opened fire. The M60 hammered. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness. North Vietnamese soldiers fell. More kept coming, wave after wave. The machine gun jammed. With several men already dead or wounded, Forsdyke and the survivors fell back to the artillery positions. Behind them, the mortar platoon was being overrun. Lieutenant Jensen heard one of his men yelling, "There are about 400 Nogs about 50 yards away." Then they were in among the mortars, firing into shell scrapes, throwing grenades. The assault companies were moving in long, straight lines of 150 to 200 men, textbook NVA tactics. They were attacking from the northeast, through the mortar platoon, then on to the artillery battery. The gunners saw them coming, barely. Shadows moving fast through the darkness. The gun crews had been standing at their howitzers, having just completed a fire mission to the north. The guns were pointed directly into the line of the assault. Luck, pure luck. But luck means nothing without trained men who know what. The Australian gunners did what Australian gunners have done since the Western Front in 1918. They lowered the barrels of their 105mm howitzers and fired directly at the enemy, point-blank range, over open sights. High explosive rounds detonating in the faces of charging North Vietnamese soldiers. The effect was devastating. Each round killed or wounded dozens of men. The gun crews worked like machines. Load, fire, load, fire. 30 seconds between rounds. Faster, faster. The enemy kept coming. Reached the gun line. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted between the howitzers. North Vietnamese soldiers overran one gun on the extreme edge of the battery, killed the crew, turned to assault the next position. Another gun was hit by RPG fire and disabled. The battery was on the edge. Lieutenant Tony Jensen, commanding the mortar platoon, faced a choice. His 18 men were scattered across their position. The North Vietnamese were among them. 2 soldiers tried to dash from their pits and were shot down. His mortars were being captured. In seconds, the entire position would be lost. Jensen made a decision that saved his platoon and possibly the entire base. He called fire onto his own position, not artillery. Splintex. Splintex rounds are 105mm artillery shells packed with 7,000 steel flechettes, steel darts. Each dart is about 10 centimeters long with a sharp point and stabilizing fins. When the shell detonates, the darts spread in a fan-shaped pattern, like a massive shotgun blast. The American term is beehive rounds. The effect on human bodies is catastrophic. Jensen shouted to his men, "Stay down." Splintex coming in. Then he called for fire. Gun number 5 of 102 field battery traversed slightly and fired 5 rounds. Splintex, directly over the mortar platoon position. The steel darts screamed overhead with a sound like tearing fabric. Everything above ground level was shredded. North Vietnamese soldiers were cut down where they stood. The assault faltered. The enemy that had been overrunning the mortar platoon withdrew, leaving their dead behind. At the artillery battery, Lieutenant E.N.A. Hearn, the gun position officer, and Captain David Brooke organized a counterattack to retake the captured howitzer. With grenades and small arms, they assaulted the gun pit. The North Vietnamese holding it were killed. The gun was recaptured. All 6 howitzers were back in Australian hands. The gun crews resumed firing. High explosive, Splintex, beehive, anything that could kill. The anti-tank platoon joined in, firing 90mm recoilless rifles loaded with Splintex across the front of the battery. Thousands of steel darts swept the battlefield. Overhead, the C-47 Spooky gunship arrived. Its flares lit the scene in harsh white light. Its 3 multi-barrel miniguns poured down 6,000 rounds per minute. Red tracer streams that looked like solid bars of light connecting the aircraft to the ground. Anything caught in those streams ceased to exist. Helicopter gunships darted in, firing rockets and machine guns. The North Vietnamese assault began to break apart. Not because they lacked courage. They were brave men, disciplined soldiers following orders. But no human wave attack can survive massed artillery fire at point-blank range combined with air support and determined defenders who will not break. By 4:30 a.m., 90 minutes after it began, the main assault had failed. Small groups of North Vietnamese soldiers remained inside the perimeter, hiding in shell scrapes, firing at shadows, trying to withdraw. They were hunted down through the pre-dawn darkness. The last enemy soldier was found and killed in the number 6 gun emplacement at 6:10 a.m. Daylight revealed the cost. 11 Australian soldiers were dead. 28 were wounded. 5 of the dead came from the mortar platoon. 5 from 18 men. A casualty rate of 72. The average age of the Australian dead was 22 years. 6 were regular soldiers. 5 were national servicemen, conscripts. Boys who had their birthdays drawn in a lottery and were sent to war. They died defending a fire support base that had not existed 24 hours earlier, in a battle they did not expect, against an enemy force far larger than they had been told was in the area. They died doing their duty. They died as soldiers. Scattered around the perimeter, clearly visible in the growing light, were 52 North Vietnamese bodies. 52 confirmed dead. The actual number was certainly higher. The NVA always retrieved their casualties when possible, dragged them away during the fighting, carry them off during the withdrawal, deny the enemy an accurate count, standard practice. But 52 bodies lay where they had fallen because there had been no time to retrieve them, no opportunity during the desperate fighting. The Australians also captured 23 small arms, 7 crew-served weapons, and 1 prisoner. A young NVA soldier, wounded, terrified, separated from his unit during the chaos. He was treated for his wounds, given water, and evacuated for interrogation. The Australians treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, always, even after battles like this. That was the Australian way. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett, commanding 1 RA, sent a message to all units. "I now believe an enemy battalion has been severely mauled, and our losses have more than been accounted for." He was understating it. The North Vietnamese battalion that attacked fire support base Coral had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Perhaps 400 men had withdrawn, but they were scattered, disorganized, shocked by the ferocity of the Australian defense. They would not attack again. Not as a unit, not with confidence. Radio Hanoi claimed a great victory. The 141st Regiment had overrun an Australian position, destroyed artillery, killed many enemy soldiers. This was propaganda. Standard communist practice. Claim victory regardless of the facts, but the North Vietnamese commanders knew the truth. They had thrown a battalion-strength force at a partially prepared Australian position and been destroyed. Now the Australians would be alert, would be dug in, would be ready. And the 7th NVA Division was committed. 3 full regiments were in the area. The operation against Saigon had failed. Now those regiments needed to withdraw to Cambodia, refit, replace their losses, prepare for future operations. But the Australians were blocking their path. The Australians had to be destroyed or driven out. The attacks would continue. Over the next 3 weeks, Fire Support Base Coral and its sister base Balmoral, 4.5 kilometers to the north, became the focal points of some of the most intense fighting Australian soldiers experienced in the entire Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese attacked again and again, and the Australians held every time. On May 16th, 4 days after the first battle, the NVA hit Coral again. This time, the Australians were ready. Defenses had been improved. Wire was strung, claymores were out, machine gun positions were reinforced. When the enemy came, they walked into interlocking fields of fire. The attack collapsed in less than an hour. Australian losses: 5 killed, 19 wounded. North Vietnamese losses: 42 confirmed dead, 7 prisoners. On May 24th, the Australians established Fire Support Base Balmoral 4.5 kilometers north of Coral. The purpose was to extend artillery coverage and provide a northern blocking position. The movement was conducted carefully, with infantry screening the route, helicopters overhead, artillery on call. No mistakes this time. Balmoral was properly prepared from the start, and on the same day, something arrived that would change the nature of the battle. Centurion tanks. C Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment. The Centurion was a British main battle tank. 52 tons of armour, a 20-pounder main gun later upgraded to the legendary 105mm L7, a Rolls-Royce Meteor engine that could push it to 35 kilometers per hour. Armour thick enough to stop anything the North Vietnamese had. The Centurions were magnificent machines, and in the jungles of Vietnam they were monsters. The Americans used light tanks and armoured personnel carriers. The Australians brought Centurions, and the North Vietnamese had never faced anything like them. A Centurion could drive through a rubber plantation, crushing trees as it went. It could drive over bunkers and trenches, collapsing them, burying the soldiers inside. Its main gun could destroy any fortification with a single shot. Its 2 machine guns could sweep infantry from the battlefield, and its armor made it essentially invulnerable to anything except landmines or RPGs at very close range. The North Vietnamese feared the Centurions more than anything else the Australians had. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers who would charge into machine gun fire would break and run when the tanks appeared. On May 26th, the North Vietnamese attacked Fire Support Base Balmoral, a battalion from the 165th Regiment. The assault began at 3:45 a.m. Coordinated mortar and ground attacks. The pattern was familiar now: preparatory bombardment, then waves of infantry charging the perimeter. The Australians were ready. The attack was broken up by artillery fire, mortar fire, machine gun fire, and close air support. 2 Australians were killed. 24 to 45 North Vietnamese were killed. Another failed assault, but this time the Australians did not simply hold their ground. At daylight, after the enemy had withdrawn, the Australian commanders made a decision. They counterattacked. 3 Centurion tanks from C Squadron broke out of the FSB Balmoral perimeter and assaulted the North Vietnamese positions. This was unprecedented. Fire support bases were defensive positions. You held them. You did not use them as springboards for armoured assaults, but the Australians were not interested in conventional thinking. The tanks, supported by infantry, drove into the tree line where the NVA battalion had withdrawn. The Centurions crushed bunkers, drove over fighting positions, fired their main guns and machine guns into retreating enemy soldiers. The NVA forces broke. They had never experienced anything like this. They had attacked a fortified. That was acceptable. That was expected in war. But to be pursued by tanks that could not be stopped, that crushed everything in their path, that was psychological warfare on a level they were not prepared for. The Australian counterattack on May 26th inflicted significant casualties and shattered NVA morale. It also sent a message. The Australians would not simply defend. They would attack. They would hunt. They would pursue. This was not an enemy that would sit behind wire and wait to be attacked. This was an enemy that fought like they did in Malaya, aggressively, relentlessly, without mercy. The North Vietnamese had one more major attack on May 28th. The 141st Regiment, rebuilt after its losses on May 13th, launched a final assault on Fire Support Base Balmoral. This was a full regimental attack, perhaps 1,000 men. It was the largest single assault, and it failed. The Australians had been fighting for more than 2 weeks now. They knew the enemy tactics. They knew when the attacks would come. They knew where the assault would hit. The perimeter defenses were formidable. The artillery coordination was perfect. When the North Vietnamese came out of the darkness on the 28th, they were met with a wall of fire. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, tanks firing their main guns over open sights, close air support dropping napalm and high explosive on the assault formations before they even reached the wire. The attack never had a chance. The NVA soldiers charged bravely into the firestorm. Many died in the open ground approaching the perimeter. A few reached the Australian positions and died there. By dawn, it was over. The 141st Regiment withdrew, what was left of it. This was the last major attack on either Fire Support Base Coral or Fire Support Base Balmoral. The North Vietnamese had lost. Not just the battle. They had lost the ability to continue fighting. The 7th NAA Division had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. When the battles finally ended on June 6, 1968, after 26 days of almost continuous combat, the Australians counted their losses. 25 to 26 soldiers killed, over 100 wounded. These were significant casualties for the Australian task force, the worst sustained combat losses since the Korean War. But every attack had been repulsed. Every position had been defended. Not one fire support base had been overrun. Not one unit had broken. Not one Australian soldier had run. The North Vietnamese losses were official Australian counts: 267 to 327 confirmed enemy killed, 11 captured. Hundreds of weapons seized. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Vietnamese sources, when they finally acknowledged the battle years later, admitted that the losses were far higher. The 7th Division had been rendered combat ineffective. The 141st and 165 regiments had been shattered. Unity cohesion was destroyed. Morale was broken. Veterans from those units later spoke of the horror of assaulting the Australian positions, the walls of fire, the steel rain from the Splintex rounds, the unstoppable tanks. The enemy that would not break, no matter how hard they were hit. And most terrifying of all, the realization that the Australians had been caught unprepared on May 13th and still won. What would happen if they attacked Australians who were ready? The survivors of the 7th Division did not want to find out. The strategic impact was immediate. The North Vietnamese had intended to use the area north of Saigon as a withdrawal route and staging area. The Australians blocked that route. The NVA forces that had attacked Saigon during the Second General Offensive were forced to withdraw along other routes, harried by American and South Vietnamese forces, suffering heavy casualties, unable to regroup. The offensive failed. Saigon was never seriously threatened again in 1968, but the real significance of Coral-Balmoral was what it proved. It proved that Australian tactics, developed for counterinsurgency warfare against guerrillas, were equally effective against conventional forces. The patient jungle patrolling, the aggressive ambushes, the disciplined fire control, the combined arms coordination, all of it worked just as well against NVA regulars as it did against Viet Cong guerrillas. It proved that small professional armies could defeat larger forces through superior training, tactics, and fighting spirit. The Australians at Coral-Balmoral were outnumbered on multiple occasions, attacked repeatedly by forces that should have overrun their positions, and they won every battle. It proved that the North Vietnamese Army, for all its courage and determination, could be beaten. That human wave attacks would not work against prepared defenders with modern weapons. That American claims of massive enemy casualties were not always exaggerated propaganda. Sometimes the enemy really did lose hundreds of men in a single night. Sometimes the body count was accurate. It proved that armored forces, used intelligently, could be decisive even in the jungles of Vietnam. The Centurion tanks at Coral-Balmoral were used in ways that no doctrine anticipated, breaking out of defensive positions, crushing bunkers, pursuing retreating enemy forces. The tanks were not supporting the infantry. The infantry were supporting the tanks. Offensive armor operations it worked, and it terrified the enemy. Most importantly, Coral-Balmoral proved that the Australians were different. This was not just propaganda, not just reputation. It was demonstrated fact. When the Pentagon sent observers to study the battles, they asked Australian commanders, How their units consistently achieved such high kill ratios with such low casualties? The answer was training, doctrine, discipline, fire control, patience, aggression when needed, defensive skill when attacked, the willingness to call artillery fire on your own position to save your men, the courage to counterattack when conventional wisdom said to consolidate, the refusal to accept defeat even when everything goes wrong. These were not things that could be easily transferred to American units. The American Army was a conscript force fighting a war it did not believe in. The Australian Army in Vietnam was smaller, more cohesive, more professional. Not better soldiers as individuals, better trained, better led, better prepared for the specific type of warfare they were fighting. The Americans learned some lessons from Coral-Balmoral. Improved artillery tactics, better defensive planning for fire support, more aggressive patrolling around defensive positions. But they could not replicate the Australian approach. The doctrine was different, the culture was different, the war was different for Australian soldiers who had volunteered to be there or been conscripted from a country that supported the war than it was for American draftees who questioned why they were in Vietnam at all. For the North Vietnamese, Coral-Balmoral was a lesson in the cost of underestimating an enemy. They had believed the Australians were just another Western army, another group of white soldiers who did not understand jungle warfare, who relied on technology and firepower, who would break if hit hard enough. They learned that was not true. The Australians were not like the Americans. The Australians moved like ghosts through the jungle, set ambushes that were invisible until they opened fire, tracked enemy units for days without being detected, and when attacked, they fought with a ferocity that matched anything the North Vietnamese could throw at them. After Coral-Balmoral, captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that NVA and Viet Cong units were specifically warned about Australian areas of operation, told to avoid contact if possible, told that engaging Australian units would result in heavy casualties, told that the Australians were the most dangerous enemy in Tricor. This was not respect. This was fear. Healthy, practical fear based on hard experience. The kind of fear that keeps soldiers alive by teaching them not to engage an enemy they cannot defeat. The Australians had earned that fear, not through atrocities, not through terror tactics, but through professional military competence demonstrated again and again in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province and in the battles around Coral and Balmoral. They had shown that they could not be beaten, that attacking them was suicide, that the best option was to go somewhere else, fight someone else, avoid the... For the Australian soldiers who fought at Coral-Balmoral, the battle was both a victory and a trauma. They had won. They had held their ground against overwhelming odds. They had inflicted devastating losses on the enemy, but they had also seen friends killed, had carried wounded mates to medevac helicopters, had buried enemy dead in mass graves, had fired artillery onto their own positions because there was no other choice, had fought hand-to-hand in the darkness, had experienced the reality of modern combat in all its horror and chaos and random chance. Many suffered from what was then called battle fatigue or combat stress, and would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the 3:30 a.m. attacks, about the sound of incoming rockets, about the screams of wounded men, about the smell of cordite and blood and burned flesh. Some could never speak about what they had experienced. Some could speak of nothing else. All carried Coral-Balmoral with them for the rest of their lives. The Australian government awarded the battle honour Coral to the units that participated: the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, the 12th Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery, C Squadron 1st Armoured Regiment, the Engineers, the Signals Units. All received official recognition that they had fought in one of the significant battles of the war. 34 individual decorations for gallantry were awarded. Lieutenant Ian Ahern received the Military Cross for his counterattack to recapture the howitzer. Lieutenant Tony Jensen was recognized for his decision to call fire onto his own position. Numerous others received awards for actions during the 3-week battle, but for many veterans the greatest honor was simply surviving, being remembered. The title of this documentary asks how 108 Australian diggers destroyed an entire NVA regiment. That specific number refers to a different battle, the Battle of Long Tan in 1966, where 108 men of D Company 6 RA fought off a force of over 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. Long Tan was a different story, a different miracle. But it shares with Coral-Balmoral a common: Australian soldiers, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting for their lives, refusing to break, refusing to run, standing their ground and destroying an enemy force that should have annihilated them. At Coral-Balmoral, the numbers were larger. Approximately 2,500 to 3,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers of the 1st Australian Task Force faced elements of the North Vietnamese 7th Division, totaling 3,000 to 4,000 men. Over 26 days of combat, the Australians killed or captured between 278 and 338 confirmed enemy soldiers while suffering 25 to 26 killed, and over 100 wounded themselves. But the actual impact was far greater than the body count suggests. The 7th NVA Division was destroyed as a fighting force. It did not participate in major operations for the rest of 1968. Its regiments were pulled back to Cambodia to rebuild. Fresh conscripts had to be brought down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to replace the losses. Officers and NCOs who survived the battle were traumatized. Unit cohesion was shattered. It would be months before the division could fight again. This is what destroying an enemy division looks like. Not just killing soldiers, breaking the unit's ability to function, shattering morale, creating an organizational collapse that takes months to repair. The Australians at Coral-Balmoral did that, not through one dramatic battle but through sustained combat over weeks. Fight after fight, attack after attack, each one repulsed, each one costing the North Vietnamese casualties they could not afford. By the end, the enemy simply stopped attacking because they had no one left to send. The battles of Coral-Balmoral remained the largest, longest, and bloodiest sustained combat operation Australian forces fought during the entire Vietnam War. More Australians were killed and wounded in those 26 days than in any other single operation. More enemy were killed than in any other Australian battle. More decorations were awarded, more units were involved. It was, in every sense, Australia's decisive battle of the Vietnam War. And yet, it remains relatively unknown outside Australia. Long Tan receives more attention, perhaps because the numbers are more dramatic. 108 men against 2,000. That is the stuff of legend. Coral-Balmoral is more complex. Multiple bases, multiple battles. A 3-week campaign rather than a single afternoon. Harder to tell as a simple story, but in terms of strategic impact, tactical innovation, and operational significance, Coral-Balmoral was more important. It proved the Australian approach to counterinsurgency warfare. It validated the tactics that had been developed in Malaya and refined in Phuoc Tu. It demonstrated that those tactics could defeat conventional forces, not just guerrillas. It showed that small professional armies could achieve results disproportionate to their size through superior training and doctrine, and it created a reputation that protected Australian soldiers for the rest of the war. After Coral-Balmoral, the enemy avoided Australians when possible. That meant fewer casualties, fewer body bags going home, fewer telegrams to grieving families. Reputation saved lives. The reputation earned at Coral-Balmoral saved Australian lives for the remaining years of the war. In May 2018, 50 years after the battle, survivors gathered at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra for the 50th anniversary commemoration. Old men now, grey-haired, some in wheelchairs, some using walking sticks. But when they stood together, when they remembered, you could see the young soldiers they had been, the diggers of Coral-Balmoral, the men who held fire support bases Coral and Balmoral against everything the North Vietnamese Army could throw at them, the men who fired artillery over open sights at charging enemy soldiers, the men who called Splintex rounds onto their own positions, the men who counterattacked with tanks when conventional doctrine said to defend. The men who fought for 26 days and never lost. They remembered friends who did not come home, whose names are inscribed on the honor roll, whose graves are in Australian war cemeteries, or whose ashes were scattered in places they loved. They remembered the fear, the chaos, the exhaustion, the elation of survival, the guilt of surviving when others did not. They remembered being 22 years old in the darkness at Fire Support Base Coral, with an enemy battalion charging out of the night, and only their rifles and their mates and their training standing between them and death. They remembered winning, against the odds, against expectations, against an enemy that should have destroyed them. They won, and the title of this documentary, How 108 Australian Diggers Destroyed an Entire NVA Regiment, captures the essence of what they achieved. Even if the specific numbers refer to a different battle, it captures the spirit of the Australian soldier in Vietnam, outnumbered but not outfought, attacked but never defeated, earning a reputation that made the enemy think twice before engaging, proving that small units of well-trained professional soldiers can defeat larger forces through skill, courage, and refusal to accept defeat. The lessons of Coral-Balmoral remain relevant today. Modern militaries study the battle as an example of combined arms defense. The coordination between infantry, artillery, armor, engineers, and air support, the use of artillery in direct fire mode, the employment of tanks in offensive operations from defensive positions, the importance of aggressive patrolling and intelligence gathering, the value of realistic training and professional NCO leadership, the necessity of logistics and sustainment during extended operations. All of these lessons are documented in the after-action reports and official histories and staff college studies. But the real lesson of Coral-Balmoral is simpler and harder to teach. It is the lesson that soldiers learn in combat and carry with them forever. The lesson that you do not give up. You do not break. You do not run. When the enemy is charging out of the darkness, when your friends are dying around you, when everything is chaos and you are terrified and exhausted and do not think you can go on, you go on anyway. You fight, you hold, you win. That is what the Australians did at Fire Support Base Coral and Fire Support Base Balmoral in May and June 1968. They faced the fury of the North Vietnamese 7th Division. They were attacked repeatedly by forces that should have overrun them, and they held. Every time. They destroyed the enemy as an effective fighting force. They blocked the withdrawal route from Saigon. They validated Australian tactics and doctrine. They earned a reputation that protected their comrades for the rest of the war. And they came home, those who survived, carrying the memory of what they had done. The memory of the night the North Vietnamese Army learned that attacking Australians was a mistake they would not make again. If you found this story powerful, if you learned something you did not know about the Vietnam War, if you want to hear more documented military history that honors the soldiers who fought, then subscribe to Vietnam War Records right now. Hit that bell notification so you never miss an episode. Share this video with anyone who cares about military history, about the Vietnam War, about the Australian soldiers who fought with courage and skill in a war far from home. Leave a comment telling us what you think. What other battles should we cover? What stories need to be told? We read every comment. Your engagement keeps this channel alive and allows us to bring you more stories like this. True history, documented facts, the real story of the Vietnam War. Subscribe now, join the Vietnam War Records community, and remember the soldiers who fought at Coral and Balmoral. Remember what they did. Remember that they won. Remember that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys hold the line and the enemy breaks.